Hi there, I thought I'd share a short video reflection on the scripture readings that are being suggested for churches to read this Sunday. It's going to be the 22nd of October, and I have been looking for a fair while at the readings from the Jewish scripture, but I'm going to be switching to the New Testament letters, the epistles, for a little while. And today's epistle is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1 to 10, and the gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 22, verse 15 to 22. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video up again. So when we're reading 1 Thessalonians, this is the earliest letter of Paul, but it's actually coming from a team. It's coming from the missionary team of Paul, Silas, and Timothy. This is also probably the earliest Christian writing that we have. And it would have been sent for somebody to read out when the church in Thessaloniki gathered together. They would have been gathering at somebody's house, and somebody who was literate would have read it out to everybody. And it appears that they were really impacted by this particular letter. They kept going back to it and reading it again, making copies of it and sharing the letter around to other churches so that other church gatherings could read it out and be encouraged by this letter as well. And that's how we started getting a collection of Christian scripture, because Christians were sharing letters amongst themselves, letters that they found encouraging, and a body of Christian holy texts started to develop across the world. Thessaloniki was a Greek port city that had been under Roman rule for about 200 years. In the Roman Empire, it was capital of the province of Macedonia, and it was very cosmopolitan, with gods of different countries being worshipped there. The Roman emperor was also worshipped as a god there, and there was a large Jewish community in Thessaloniki. But it seems like the Christian community that Paul and Silas and Timothy were writing to had mostly not come from Jewish religious backgrounds, but had come from the nations of the world, people that had worshipped all those different gods in Thessaloniki. Because in the letter they describe the Christians in Thessaloniki as people who have turned to God from idols to serving a living and true God. So it sounds like the church was made up of people who had previously worshipped the many gods of Thessaloniki. As we heard about the last two Sundays when we're looking at the Jewish scripture from the book of Exodus, in the Jewish faith, people weren't allowed to worship using idols. And that was the context that Christianity had come from, so it was the same in Christianity. These are people, the people that are being written to in the letter, they're people who Paul and Silas and Timothy had previously visited as they were traveling about the Roman world, sharing the good news of Christ. But the impression I get when hearing this letter being read out to us again is that it wasn't just this trio of itinerant Jewish Christians who were bringing the good news to Thessalonian pagans, but also they have received the good news back from the Thessalonians too. The message has made its way back to them from Thessalonica via the network of Greek churches and through churches across the world. And this has built them up and encouraged them as they've been traveling around sharing the good news. And now they're writing back to the Thessalonian church to continue building up the Thessalonians and to encourage them. I think in our church, many of us have become pretty uncomfortable with the idea of mission and evangelism. And I think it's because of the way that our churches have gone about it, particularly in these lands. It hasn't been a mutual thing, I don't think, where both parties are revealing the good news to each other and building each other up. In so much of the church's history in these lands, the missionary churches have come to communities and they've come as partners of the colonial government and with the power associated with the colonial government. Like the Greek city of Thessaloniki, we've also worshipped the power of empire. Our churches came into these lands thinking that we were the only ones with something to share, as though we had actually brought God here with us. Many Indigenous Christians witness that their peoples had already encountered the Creator God before European churches arrived here. In recognition of this, in my church, in the Uniting Church, we've added a preamble to our constitution, and it says that through this land, God has nurtured and sustained the first peoples of this country, the Aboriginal and Islander peoples, who continue to understand themselves to be the traditional owners and custodians, meaning sovereign in the languages of the first peoples of these lands and waters since time immemorial. And then it goes on to say, the first peoples had already encountered the Creator God before the arrival of the colonizers. The Spirit was already in the land revealing God to the people through law, custom and ceremony. The same love and grace that was finally and fully revealed in Jesus Christ sustained the first peoples and gave them particular insights into God's ways. Whatever perspective we're coming from, whether it is a settler migrant perspective like mine, or whether it's an Indigenous perspective, we might see some problems that come up for us with these statements, or we might need to ask some questions about them. From one perspective, we might ask, if Indigenous folks knew that God through the land, does that mean that they knew God before Christianity existed? Does that mean they knew God before any form of Jewish faith existed? Does that mean that they knew God before Abraham heard the call of God to set out for Canaan? And if we're using the name God when talking about Indigenous spirituality, does that mean that we're forcing Indigenous spirituality into European Christian categories? As we ponder these questions, I think it's important that we do what we should have done all along. We need to take the time to listen back to the people who we have shared our faith with as European Christians like myself. Because we need to be open to what First Peoples have to share with us too. And we need to be open to the possibility that our faith is transformed and changed and renewed by the news that they have to share with us. In today's Gospel reading, we have Jesus being asked about his loyalty to the empire. This is following straight on from last week's Gospel reading. Jesus has just shut down the temple, a place where a revolution had happened in previous generations. And then he's come back again to the temple the next day to tell a story about a cruel and violent ruler. And now immediately after that, we have leaders from two opposing factions within the Jewish community coming to question Jesus. When we hear about the Pharisees and the Herodians in the Gospels, when we hear about those two Jewish groups, we need to remember that we really only are getting a caricature of them. It's being presented by their Christian rivals, so it's not really going to be fair. But the idea is that the Pharisees don't want to have anything to do with the Romans or with other nations, whereas the Herodians have been happy to collaborate with the Romans and take on the customs of Rome and Greece and other imperial cultures, serving as local rulers on behalf of the emperor. So they're happy to compromise. And these two groups in the story, they're trying to trap Jesus with their questions, because if he says that they shouldn't pay tax to the emperor, he can be painted as an enemy of the emperor, agitating against the emperor, a revolutionary, taking over the temple to start another war against Rome. But if he says that they should pay the tax, they can say that he's not following the Jewish faith, because each Roman coin used to pay the tax is pressed with a propaganda image of the emperor, who's considered a god. It's worshipped as a god. Paying tax to the emperor with that coin is worshipping an imperial idol. But this backfires on Jesus' rivals because he doesn't have a coin to pay the tax with. He isn't participating in this economy that worships the power of empire. It's his questioners who happen to just have a coin handy that represents a whole day's wages. Jesus sees that the coin has the emperor's image pressed onto it and says that it belongs to the emperor, and so it should be returned to the emperor because it bears his image. And he says they should give to God what is God's. The Jewish tradition is that every human being bears the image of God. Jesus is saying that they should give the emperor back all the Roman money because it bears the emperor's image, and that they should give themselves to God because they bear God's image. In the epistle, we heard about Christian missionaries receiving the good news from the people that they were sent to evangelize. And in the preamble to the Uniting Church Constitution, we heard that First Peoples had already encountered God before contact with the church. In the Gospel, we heard about regular human beings revealing the image of God. Let's be ready to share the good news with others when the opportunity arises and when it's appropriate, when it's welcome. Let's be open to what God is revealing to us through the people around us, whatever their culture, whatever their faith.